I actually want to focus on is creating a revolution in how we speak about government. I actually think it's impossible to do what she was talking about, or actually what Herb was asking she to do, which is to think of how to get scientists, or basically anyone with real kind of talent and expertise at a high level to join government if we continue to talk about government as simply kind of a meddler, a regulator, an administrator, or at best a facilitator that de-risks the private sector. Okay, so what I'm going to actually talk to you about in how much time I have? 19 minutes. Is government as a shaper and a creator of markets, government as an innovator, not everywhere in the world, but in the few places in the world, the few regions in some countries which have actually done what policymakers around the world are trying to do, especially after the crisis, but also before, which is to achieve not any kind of growth, but growth that is smart, and by that they mean innovation-led, and I'm going to add to that growth that is also inclusive and sustainable. These are very trendy words. I actually want to give them some meaning. And I start with this wonderful quote by Keynes, because every time I talk about government and this ambition and vision that government should have, then the first thing people say is, oh, but be careful, you're talking about, government's going to get captured by, like different types of industry interests and, different types of corruption. And this wonderful quote by Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, who you hopefully have heard about, he was one of the biggest thinkers about thinking about government, basically is arguing that the biggest kind of capture is the capture, or what he calls the encroachment of ideas. And unfortunately, it's often economists' ideas that are very much limiting the way that policymakers think, even when they don't even recognize those ideas. So it's a very important quote, because so much of what I'm actually trying to do is to really liberate policymakers and politicians from this very narrow way that, economists, but not only, have been thinking about government. And just quickly, these sort of three different ways that I have up here about the way that people talk about government, besides, let's just put the Tea Party to the side right now, right? I'm talking about the sort of intelligent adult conversation out there, is, at best, government sort of fixing what we call market failures. The most typical market failure in the technology area, the science area, is of course basic research, okay? So basic research is a public good. I'm not going to go into the details here, I don't have time, but a public good is a good, for example, that has such high spillovers, right? So, big science, big blue sky thinking, basic research, it's very hard for a private firm, company, to appropriate individually the returns, the profits from that kind of research, and hence, you have underinvestment in basic research by the private sector. So very few people, again, of the adult conversation about government will actually disagree with the fact that government should be funding, basic research, and this is why I sound American, but I'm actually Italian, I promise, because when I was 5, my father, who does nuclear fusion, which is the good stuff, it's not nuclear fission, was asked to go to Princeton University, funded completely by the US government, their Department of Energy and Atomic Energy, to do that kind of basic research, and again, even the right-wing conservatives in America think that's a good use of public spending. Now, the other thing, of course, people agree with is that, government should basically set the rules of the game, so fund kind of like infrastructure, education, skills. Again, there's massive cuts being made to those areas, so I'm not saying there's no debate there, but, that's more or less accepted, right? Now, what I want to argue for, or try to convince you, is that actually what government has done, again, in the few places in the world, like Silicon Valley, and I would argue China today, some parts of Germany, Denmark, Finland, Brazil, is actually having government that's done much more than just those two things, fixing market failures or setting the game, the rules of the game. It's actually played a revolutionary role of being the direct investor, the direct risk taker, getting things done much before the private sector is even willing to engage in areas like the internet, nanotech, biotech. And I just put up this quote here by The Economist, which I am subscribed to, and I like the inside, but the editorial sections just make me always think, my God, talk about the Taliban's, this very evangelical kind of way of talking about government, which is, government, just stick to the basics and then get out of the way and let the revolutionaries, which are basically, you guys with all sorts of tech experience and in the private sector, do their thing. And so what this leads to is all sorts of policies And the reason you'll see later why I have a lion on the cover of my book is because these policies are constantly leading to this image, if you want, of business as a lion or a wolf or a tiger kind of wanting to roar, in the case of the lion, but they're in a cage, and all government has to do is sort of take away these different types of impediments, whether they be different types of taxes, we need to give them tax incentives, or reduce tax, corporate income tax, capital gains tax, or take away all that damn red tape. Was that a swear word? No. Anyway, right, all that darn red tape, right? So get rid of this bureaucracy, which is impeding this revolutionary private sector. And what I want to basically argue is that this assumption, right, of this really revolutionary private sector and, which side are they on? That way, private sector, and this necessary but a bit boring, inertial kind of dinosaur bureaucratic government is an extremely dangerous myth. It is a fabrication, just like the fabricated image of the lazy Mexican under the palm tree with the sombrero was fabricated at a time when the US actually, well, this is a long historical note. I did Latin American studies as my undergraduate minor, not major, in undergraduate education, where that image of the lazy Mexican was a fabricated image during a period of the Mexican-American War, where America, in order to capture this huge Mexican territory, which later became Texas, California, New Mexico, had to portray the Mexican as lazy, right? In order to get that land, we are more productive. I want to argue, and what I do argue in my book, is that this image of this revolutionary private sector and a boring, but yes, necessary public sector has actually justified a theft. It has justified very wrong policies, which are leading to the lack of growth. But I definitely, in talking about the reason I use such strong language in terms of theft is I want to give you, at the end of my talk, a very different interpretation of why sometimes we have innovation and inequality actually happening at the same time. Okay, and I want to talk to you about that in terms of value capture, the extraction of value, as opposed to just a problem of de-skilling. But let me just stick to the subject right now. So what I want to argue is that all these big technologies, the big technological changes, the revolutionary radical changes, which economists talk about as general purpose technologies, which are technologies that have really affected sort of productivity and growth in all sectors, like the internet, had much more than the government just fixing little problems here and there. Okay, they actually required government to engage in that upper right-hand quadrant, which is often the area where you have the highest risk and uncertainty, both technologically and market-wise, but also very high capital intensity. And especially if you look at the whole innovation chain, which, by the way, is not linear, you have constant kind of feedback effects. What you have had, and this is just showing you for the US in the orange names here, what you have had is government actually being extremely active along the entire chain, right? So this is that basic research public good problem. Well, those investments that led to all those general purpose technologies, from aerospace to the internet to biotech and nanotechnology, actually required a very active, visible hand across the entire chain. So this is the DARPAs, which funded the internet, the National Science Foundation, the CIA, which is actually one of the biggest public venture capital funds in the US, called In-Q-Tel. And in fact, often when I talk about this issue, at least in the US, people say, oh, but you're just talking about the military-industrial complex. But as I'll show you in a minute, these examples are also in health and in energy. This data here just shows you the Small Business Innovation Research Program in the US, which compared to private venture capital has actually done much more funding, even of the companies themselves. So not just basic research, also applied research and even early stage high risk finance to companies like Compaq and Intel. Apple got $500,000 in its very early phase from the SBIC related program. And this money is actually just becoming more and more important precisely because private finance has become more and more short-termist, right? So venture capital, for example, wants its returns in 3 years, mainly focused on an exit, which mainly occurs through an IPO, an initial public offering. 3 years is not going to get you very far in areas like nanotech, biotech, internet, and today clean technology, which really take 15 to 20 years. And so this is why this kind of patient, long-term committed finance that has actually come from these different types of public agencies not only was extremely important in the past, but increasingly important today as private finance is really kind of retreating from the economy, just kind of financing itself. Now this figure here, I've allowed you to look at it for a while because it's a bit complicated, but just the one-liner is that every technology that makes the iPhone so smart and not idiotic, right? So the fact that you can search the web with it, you can know where you are with it, GPS, you can, touchscreen display, even the Siri thing, which never works on my phone, but apparently it's really cool. It was all funded by government, and this is just showing you which, parts of the government which are actually funding it. And as I said before, people in Europe, right, often get, a bit worried about those names there, like the CIA or the Department of Defense appearing a lot, and they say, again, that's the military-industrial complex. So then I say, yes, but it's actually created a model to be applied across different sectors like health and energy. This data here is just showing you how much the US government, even after the crisis, even after all the Tea Party battle to get government cuts to be enacted, how much the government has been spending, even though this is currently being threatened, in places like health through the National Institutes of Health, which is a huge, I think it's the second after the Department of Defense in terms of funding innovation. This money mainly financing the whole pharma/biotech sector from basic research to applied research, $32 billion just in 2012, okay? In, again, a year in which there was lots of battles in terms of funding. Today, this funding is being threatened by something like potential 25% cuts. But just to say this money has been extremely important, especially in financing, by the way, the most revolutionary drugs. So new molecular entities with priority rating, something like 75% of those actually come out of that funding. Now, of course, the big question for many people interested in the next big thing after the internet is, well, what will that be? And many, including myself, and I think also including Chi, hope that it will be something green, right? And so it's quite interesting when you start looking at green and clean tech investments, who's doing what, and it's, again, that upper right-hand quadrant, high capital intensity, high technological market risk is almost completely void of private finance. The private sector is increasingly, the corporate money is increasingly decommitting to it with large energy companies or even the big sovereign wealth fund in Norway. I'm going there tomorrow to talk to them. Not spending on innovation, but on different sort of speculative areas. And so it's very interesting if you actually look at these databases that do exist out there, like Bloomberg New Energy Finance, you can actually look at who's financing what in clean technology. And what's very interesting to me, because I've never actually studied public banks, I've studied more public agencies like the DARPAs, the National Science Foundations, in this country, the Medical Research Council, is that these public investment banks are taking an increasing role. So this green line here is showing you these state investment banks like the KfW in Germany, BNDES in Brazil, the China Development Bank, which alone are actually spending more than 10 times, just these four banks, sorry, I forgot to add there, the European Investment Bank, more than 10 times the worldwide private sector on clean technology. So that would be private equity, venture capital, corporate funds, and stock market. If you add them all up for the whole world, it's 10 times less than just what these four banks have been spending recently. Now, what's interesting is that these, in fact, I thought so, I didn't have that data. Anyway, I would have shown you the data for both the KfW and the China Development Bank. China's Development Bank alone has been financing particular green kind of wind and solar companies in China for the amounts of almost like $2 billion per company, which is a lot of money. It's the same amount of money, by the way, that Huawei, #1 in telecommunications, a Chinese company, got from this bank. And it's often judged as anti-competitive, right? Because this is public money actually backing, picking companies, picking technologies, which I just showed you before also happened in the case of the iPhone. All the technologies there were picked by government. It wasn't a big ministry or the bank. It was just this decentralized network of public agencies. But also, again, Compaq, Intel as companies were picked. Tesla Motors, the big new hero in Silicon Valley, right? Elon Musk completely picked. 500 million guaranteed loan from the Obama administration. Same amount, by the way, that Solyndra, right? The solar company, which however went bust, right? So Solyndra today, people recognize that name often because it's been used both by the media, by economists, and by policymakers to warn people against government, right? Because government picked Solyndra, the company goes bust, so how stupid was that? Government kind of unable to pick winners to actually make really great things happen because just a bunch of bureaucrats. Well, the same government picked Tesla, right? So one question is, of course, what to do. You know, how do you actually engage with that kind of portfolio kind of analysis where you will win some, you'll lose some, which I'll get to in my last slide. But before I talk about that, this issue here is one of the biggest ones, which is financialization. In other words, we don't just want to ask government to do more, you know, finance green tech just like you finance the internet. We need a more engaged private sector too, right? Because the internet and all these great technologies that are behind the iPhone, like touchscreen, actually came out of an ecosystem of innovation, very trendy word. In other words, public-private partnerships. And the problem is that these partnerships today are increasingly missing the real ones, and I call them symbiotic partnerships versus parasitic ones, so symbiotic ecosystem versus parasitic ecosystem because of this increasingly financialized economy. This is just a nice graph from Andy Haldane's work at the Bank of England, which shows you how much finance has outpaced the real economy. Okay, so financial intermediation as a percentage of gross value added, which basically is showing you that finance is just kind of lending to itself, but especially financialization of the real economy is one of my worries, which is how much private companies, this is the data for the Fortune 500 companies, have been spending their profits, well, either hoarding them, we're today at record levels of hoarding, but also when they're spending increasingly on these financialized measures like share buybacks, right? You buy back your own shares to boost your stock price, which boosts your stock option, which boosts executive pay. So $3 trillion in just the last decade. Apple, a company that never did share buybacks, as soon as Steve Jobs passed away, began its new big business model under Tim Cook, which has seen a 60 billion share buyback scheme, which I've just written a piece with Bill Lazonick on what does that tell us about Apple's future. Now, why is this important? Because, as I said before, even though I'm someone who keeps arguing for a different narrative about the state alone cannot, of course, do what it did in terms of the internet and touchscreen, because there were companies like Xerox PARC, Bell Labs, so private laboratories in the private sector co-investing alongside the state in those big areas. That data I just showed you before for the green tech public versus private R&D is worrying. And you do have some illuminated figures like Bill Gates saying, you know, of course we need an active public sector and the private sector will follow. But this actually comes from an American Energy Industry Council that he runs along with 6 other CEOs. And Bill Lazonick and I did a calculation of how much these 7 companies who are arguing for government to step in and, you know, fund innovation, which of course both Chi and I think is an important thing for government to do. However, those companies themselves aren't, if you want, doing their bit, right? So this is why innovation policy, which people like Chi and others think about, has to go hand in hand with corporate governance issues, with definancialization of the real economy, okay? And now why is this important? Because in order to change the ways that we actually talk about government, from just de-risking to actually taking on risk, we actually have to be talking about it in sort of meaningful ways, right? So again, this ecosystem terminology, which is so fashionable, actually you know, getting at indicators, concrete indicators through which policymakers can know whether we are building parasitic versus symbiotic public-private ecosystems is really important, but that's not the current way that we're talking about it. So the whole life sciences strategy, for example, in the UK, but also in the US, is about just kind of financing that sector without actually asking companies, say like Pfizer and Amgen, to change how they behave, because these companies, in fact, spend almost just as much as they spend on R&D on these kind of financialized measures like share buybacks, which I think are really a big problem. Now, in terms of the inclusive growth part that I promised I'd say something about, and inequality, this is absolutely fundamental. Because unless you first start admitting that government has done so much more than just fixing market failures or creating these kind of basic conditions like the roads, the infrastructure, the skills, and actually admit that the government has been, in the few places in the world, like Silicon Valley, been able and willing to finance the kind of scary stuff that the private sector only enters later in that upper right-hand quadrant, then we don't even admit that the government has been a lead risk taker. And by government, I mean the taxpayer, okay? And because so many of these companies like Google and Apple and Amazon and Facebook don't pay much tax, okay? And, you know, corporate income tax has fallen a lot in the last years. The upper marginal rate under Eisenhower, he was not a communist, he was a Republican general, was close to 85%, that upper marginal rate. I am not arguing we go back to that tax system. However, the tax system is no longer as functional as it used to be. So what I argue often is that in order to get growth, not only to be smart, but also more inclusive, so for example, the public school system in Silicon Valley can also benefit from the investments that fed the innovation system there. Maybe we should open up the conversation and allow government actually, through these different agencies, to retain either equity, or we should have income contingent loans like we do with students. Why not with business? Retaining a bit of a share of the IPR, why not? Now, I don't want to give concrete sort of solutions to that problem. I want to open the conversation, and the only way to open the conversation is to think again about this complete mythological fabrication, which is this boring but necessary public sector and a dynamic, creative private sector, and admit they both must be equally dynamic and creative.